The first reports reached the Galactic Council while Hespera was still burning, and even then the Imperial delegates argued over shipping rights, while 12 million humans died under a sky that had been peeled open like metal. The city had been a white ring of towers anchored over the equatorial Atlantic, a place built for diplomats, climate engineers, freight handlers, and the refugee families the Council said it could not officially protect. It had no shield grid worth naming, no heavy batteries, no military garrison larger than a ceremonial orbital patrol. It had hospitals, schools, embassies, 2 orbital elevators rising out of the sea like silver threads. When the Keled Empire fired from beyond lunar range, the first lance cut both elevators. The second turned the harbor into steam, and the third stayed on target until the city's power spine ruptured and the ocean itself climbed into the wound. The footage was everywhere within minutes. Children lit red by emergency strobes, a wall of water folding through glass districts, a woman in council white screaming into a dead comm line. By the time the broadcast cut, the line had already been crossed. For 3 years before that strike, the galaxy had treated humanity like an inconvenience that had somehow learned to read treaties. Humans were too new, too soft, too obsessed with process. They filed evidence, they sent inspectors, they argued over language in interstellar law, while older empires flexed fleets and moved borders by inertia. The Keled despised them for it. To them, restraint was cowardice with paperwork. Human cargo convoys ran unarmed through contested systems because they believed law had to exist, even where power did not. Human diplomats went anywhere, met anyone, and kept showing up with offers to mediate, rebuild, and verify. That calm irritated everybody, especially the empires who had spent centuries teaching the galaxy that peace only existed at the edge of a gun. The Keled throne saw Earth's rise as an insult wrapped in manners. Then humanity made the mistake that arrogant powers always wait for. They embarrassed an empire in public. It started at Telman Gate, where Keled warships had been stopping civilian transports from the vast refuge corridor and disappearing the passengers into security processing. Humans caught them, not with spies, with manifests, life support records, and 56 hours of authenticated sensor logs presented live before the Council. The human ambassador did not shout. She did not threaten. She simply asked whether the law meant what it said, or whether the galaxy wanted to stop pretending. In that silence, the Keled delegates lost more than a vote. They lost face. Sanctions followed. Inspections followed. Smaller species that had bowed for generations suddenly cited Terran precedent and demanded access to prison moons and labor registries. The old order did not crack all at once. It split along legal seams humans had patiently widened for years. And when the Keled military command asked the throne for permission to make an example, they did not ask for Earth. They asked for one city. Just one. Enough pain to teach the new species its place. The justification came wrapped in lies. Keled intelligence claimed Hespera concealed a tactical relay for Terran fleet targeting. Their war minister announced a limited decapitation strike against an unlawful dual-use logistics hub. The Council knew it was false almost before the words were finished. Their own observers were inside the city. The refugee processing archives were there. The medical convoys were there. 2 neutral diplomatic compounds had transmitted clear civilian status for days because human analysts had already intercepted fragments of Imperial fire authorization. Earth filed warnings. Earth demanded an emergency session. Earth even opened its local defense net to Council monitors to prove no fleet assets were sheltering at Hespera. The Kelid fired anyway. Some delegates walked out in protest. Some called for restraint on both sides. Some said the matter required investigation. Investigation. While rescue drones pulled burned children from boiling water. While a city sank by degrees into its own wreckage. The Kelid thought outrage would make humans reckless. The Council thought grief would make them negotiable. Both were wrong. What frightened the chamber later was not the fury. It was the silence that came after. 6 hours after Hespera fell, every Terran envoy in Council space rose at exactly the same second and left their posts. No denunciations, no grand speeches, no threats. They simply placed black data wafers on their desks and walked out. Security teams opened the wafers expecting demands. Instead, they found casualty rolls, strike telemetry, and a single legal notice encoded in every known diplomatic language. The deliberate annihilation of a protected human population center constitutes irrevocable entry into existential war. Interstellar law remains in force. Terran obligations to preserve non-combatant life remain in force. Relief corridors to all neutral systems remain open. All treaties concerning Kelid strategic privacy are suspended. Then, at the bottom, signed not by a president or prime minister, but by the Terran Continuity Directorate, were 6 words that nobody outside human history had ever heard before. Nightfall Protocol has been invoked worldwide. The Kelid laughed when they saw it. Their admirals called it melodrama. Their throne world press ran smug panels about human theatricality and emotional weakness. They expected missile salvos, border raids, desperate fleet concentrations around Earth and Mars. Instead, Terran naval assets disappeared from every chart the galaxy trusted. Convoys stopped transmitting routes. Civilian traffic rerouted itself with machine precision. Shipyards went dark. Human stations near foreign borders evacuated in less than 2 hours, leaving behind nothing but sterilized docks and deactivated beacons. Not a single retaliatory shot was fired on the first day. Not one on the second. That was when doubt began. Because empires understood rage. They understood vengeance, pride, panic, and overextension. What they did not understand was a species that had just watched one of its brightest cities die and responded by becoming quieter. On the 3rd day, Terran observatories on Mercury shut down their public feeds. On the 4th, every human embassy transmitted a final advisory to local populations. Store food. Secure medical power. Remain indoors at first dark. At first dark. Those words spread faster than rumor should have. The first alien world to go dark was Kelid Prime, and for 19 seconds, nobody understood what they were seeing. Their dawn line had already crossed the inland capitals when the eastern sky simply vanished. Not cloud, not eclipse. The star itself was there one moment and gone the next, hidden behind a black geometric absence so vast that orbital telescopes overloaded trying to resolve its edges. Daylight collapsed into bruised twilight. Solar grids crashed in sequence. Civilian satellites lost lock, then winked out as if erased by hand. Every ship above the atmosphere reported a bloom of cold particulate shapes unfolding from nowhere around the planet's equatorial lanes. Thousands of them, then millions. Each one too small alone to matter, and together large enough to swallow a sun. Kelid Prime had backup fusion, of course. Old empires always did. But the panic was not about power. It was about reach. Something had crossed half the galaxy, penetrated the most defended space in known history, and thrown a curtain over a throne world without tripping a single perimeter alarm. By the time Command issued a coherent order, 11 more Imperial worlds had entered twilight. Then the outer colonies went dark. Then the client kingdoms. Then neutral observer states that had voted to delay sanctions after Hespera. Then species who had sold targeting data to the Kelid and assumed the transaction would stay hidden. Every world tied into the old Imperial security lattice lost its sky within 6 hours. Not all at once, not identically, but methodically, system by system, in a pattern too deliberate to be random and too comprehensive to be anything but planned. The galaxy learned the true shape of human patience in that terrible sequence. For 20 years, Terran climate missions, energy partnerships, orbital debris cleanups, and solar stabilization projects had spread through Council space. Humans had helped repair power grids, launch mirror arrays, seed upper atmospheres, and install emergency shade swarms around overheating worlds. They called it adaptation aid. They left behind maintenance protocols, autonomous fabrication spores, and tiny resilience anchors in local orbit. Nobody objected because humans were helpful, precise, and not yet feared. Nightfall protocol was hidden inside that kindness, like a blade sealed in glass. When Hespera died, every aid system humans had ever touched woke up under one command authority. The galaxy had invited the weapon into orbit with thank you speeches. Panic did what politics could not. Fleets scrambled home. Governors declared planetary emergencies. Merchant houses screamed about collapsing trade. Religious networks called the darkness divine judgment, then human sorcery, then war. Through all of it, Terran channels remained calm. A single broadcast repeated across every frequency still functioning. This is the Terran Continuity Directorate. Civilian life support corridors are available. Medical exemptions will be honored. Attempted launches by military craft will be interdicted. No star will be restored to any world whose government refuses surrender inspection for crimes committed at Hespera. You are not under extermination order. You are under sentence. The wording chilled even species that hated the Kelid, because sentence implied evidence, procedure, duration. It implied humans had not lashed out. They had judged. Worse, they had judged at a scale no civilization should have possessed. Worlds that had mocked Terran morality now begged for it. Because a cruel species would have burned them. Humans had chosen something colder. They had made entire civilizations sit awake in the dark and count what they had done. The Kelid Imperial Navy attempted to break the blackout at Varn Reach with 240 warships, including their throne carriers, their beam bastions, and the dreadnought Victorious Edict, a vessel so large it had once served as the backdrop for coronations. They charged toward what their tacticians believed was the central control lattice, a dense cloud of black sail fragments hanging over the system's inner plane. Terran ships were nowhere on long scan. That made the admirals bold. It also got them killed. The darkness around Varn Reach was not passive cover. It was a battlefield designed years before the Kelid realized war had started. Human stealth hulls drifted inside the thermal shadow of the shade cloud, cold as debris, each one linked to millions of autonomous motes carrying synchronized gravitic lenses and laser relays. When the Imperial fleet entered weapons range, space itself seemed to fold. Targeting failed. Distance lied. Beams refracted into empty black. Missiles chased false heat signatures into one another. Then, Terran fire began. Not flashy, not dramatic, just precise. Reactor throats punctured, sensor crowns excised, command bridges cut open in single white lines. The victorious edict managed one broadside before its spinal mount detonated from an impossible angle and the ship split lengthwise like fruit. 48 minutes later, the surviving Keled admiral transmitted surrender into a void full of his own dead. That battle broke more than a fleet. It shattered the assumption that humans had been hiding one superweapon. The truth was worse. They had built an entire way of war around denial, patience, and total systems understanding. They did not need to outgun the old empire's ship for ship if they could decide when those ships saw, where they moved, what powered them, and whether home still existed behind them as a place they could defend. Terran doctrine had names now pouring out of classified archives the Council could suddenly no longer suppress. Civilian continuity, adversary blindness, distributed vengeance. They had inherited the oldest fear of their own species, the dark, and industrialized it. Not because they loved destruction, because somewhere deep in their history they had learned that frightened populations obey tyrants and confused militaries make mistakes. Nightfall took both and turned them back on the aggressor. Human command let enemy worlds keep hospitals lit. They allowed desalination, heating, food synthesis, and emergency medevac. Everything else remained at their mercy. Financial markets died. Data vaults froze. Palace lights went out. Propaganda screens stayed black. Under those conditions, truth spread faster than orders. On the 7th day, the Council finally convened a wartime emergency quorum, not because its members had found courage, but because their own planets were dimming at the edges. Those who had abstained on Hespera demanded special consideration. Those who had delayed censure pleaded misunderstanding. Those who had profited from imperial contracts suddenly discovered humanitarian language. The chamber felt smaller than it ever had, full of species who had mistaken human civility for need. Earth did not send an ambassador. It sent the surviving chief archivist of Hespera, a woman with half her face rebuilt in fresh synth skin and a burn scar visible above the collar where the regenerator had run out of time. She did not bow. She did not ask permission to speak. She loaded the city's final 4 minutes into the central hall. The screams rolled out across polished stone. Imperial firing solutions overlaid children's shelters in cold blue wireframes. Council observer pings flashed ignored and overridden. Then came the footage nobody in that room would ever forget. A refugee classroom under emergency glass, 32 small figures crouched together while their teacher read from a history tablet to keep them from hearing the hull crack. The beam hit before the sentence ended. When the recording stopped, the archivist looked at the delegates sitting in their half-lit chamber and said the words that broke the rest of the galaxy. You knew. Some of you knew, and you let it proceed. After that, the neutral world stopped pretending. Ports closed to Imperial remnants. Banking syndicates surrendered shell accounts. 3 client species mutinied against Keled overseers and opened their prison stations to Terran inspectors. Even then, the Empire refused to kneel. The throne world declared the darkness proof of human monstrosity and ordered a retaliatory strike on Mars, assuming some reserve fleet still lurked beyond the blackout lines. They found one. It was waiting at the edge of Keled Prime's shadow. The Terran First Silent Fleet had not been built for parades, and nobody outside a few buried defense committees had known it existed. Its hulls carried almost no external lighting, almost no insignia, and no decorative architecture at all. They looked less like ships than verdicts. When they advanced, they did so in perfect formation, without a single open channel. Using tight beam pulses and predictive maneuvering models humans had once developed for search and rescue in debris storms. Keled orbital guns fired blind into layers of false returns. Terran ships slipped through them as if gravity had been taught obedience. In 13 minutes, every strategic platform around the throne world had been disarmed, not annihilated. Cut power feeds, frozen control buses, disabled launch cradles. Surgical, humiliating, final. Then the humans parked over the imperial capital and waited. That was the moment the Emperor learned what Hespera had actually cost him. Not territory, not ships. Narrative. He had expected humans to become what his propaganda needed. Savage upstarts, emotional mammals, dangerous but ultimately provincial. Instead, they had become the only adults left in a room full of murderers. Across the Empire, civilians looked up at a dead sky and listened to Terran relief channels calmly routing insulin shipments and water purification packs, while their own ministers hid in bunkers with stolen generator fuel. On conquered worlds, subject populations tore down statues in the dark. On border moons, garrisons surrendered for battery access and medical amnesty. Human Marines entered prisons with power cells, field kitchens, and indictments. They did not rant. They processed names. They tagged evidence. They separated executioners from conscripts and opened the cells one corridor at a time. Every action told the same story more clearly than any speech could. Humanity had not answered atrocity with chaos. Humanity had answered with capacity. The Emperor tried one last weapon anyway. Buried under the basalt bedrock of Keled Prime was an ancient stellar lance, a siege engine built in a previous age to strip atmosphere from rebellious colonies. It had been illegal for 4 treaties and secretly maintained through 12 administrations. If fired through the blackout, it would have burned half a continent and maybe cracked the orbital shade enough to restore command coordination for a few hours. That was the plan. Human intelligence had known about the lance for 16 years. They had learned of it the same way they learned everything that mattered in hostile space, by listening while they helped. Terran engineers who had once assisted with geothermal stabilizers had mapped the bedrock resonance around the hidden chamber. Terran disaster teams had quietly copied emergency evacuation routes. Terran environmental monitors had tracked the waste heat signature no one else had noticed. When the Emperor authorized ignition, the weapon powered for exactly 4 seconds before every coolant gate in the complex sealed at once. Not hacked from orbit, unlocked locally. A Terran commando unit was already inside. The lance died in its cradle. The Emperor's palace lost pressure a minute later, not to kill him, just to force the blast doors open. The arrest was broadcast in silence. By then, every alien world tied to the war understood the true horror of nightfall. Humans had reached them all, and still chosen limits. They could have crashed habitats, starved atmospheres, burned capitals, or salted biospheres from a distance no fleet could contest. The blackout proved it. Instead, they used darkness as a hand around the throat, tight enough to stop resistance, measured enough to keep the victim alive for judgment. That distinction saved humanity from becoming the nightmare the Empire accused them of being. it also made them vastly more terrifying. Because mercy from a weak species is sentiment. Mercy from a species that can end you and does not need to raise its voice is power. Council analysts later admitted the same conclusion in private reports with trembling precision. Had Terra intended extermination, the war would have lasted less than a day. The old empires had been protected for centuries by the assumption that logistics, law, and aid work were signs of softness. Now those assumptions lay dead beside Hespera, in the flooded bones of a city no one could rebuild without remembering why it had fallen. The formal surrender took place in darkness. Not symbolic darkness, real darkness. The council chamber lights stayed off, except for a narrow white lane across the floor, projected from a portable Terran field lamp brought by a naval lieutenant no older than 30. Delegates signed by that light, because their worlds still did not have their suns back. The articles were uncompromising. Full disclosure of all strike chains related to Hespera. Permanent dismantling of illegal stellar weapons. Open access to Imperial archives, prison worlds, and black budgets. Reparations not only to Earth, but to every species trafficked, bombed, or erased under cover of Kelid sovereignty. And one clause that made even hardened ministers shiver. Any future deliberate attack on a protected civilian population would trigger automatic continuity response by all human commands, without requirement for council review. The galaxy, which had once mocked Terran insistence on codifying every contingency, suddenly understood why humans wrote things down. They wrote them down so no tyrant could mistake restraint for indecision ever again. When the suns returned, they returned in stages. First, the hospital worlds, then the agricultural belts, then the trade hubs whose governors had surrendered their military traffic records in full. Kelid Prime remained under shade for another 31 days. So did the homeworlds of the two allied powers that had supplied targeting telemetry for Hespera. Those populations survived, barely inconvenienced compared to what could have been done. But every child on those worlds grew up remembering a sky that vanished because their rulers believed one human city was an acceptable price for sending a message. Hespera itself was never rebuilt. Earth stabilized the seafloor crater, ringed it with weather towers, and left the central scar untouched. Ships passing overhead dimmed their running lights by law. The names of the dead were etched into black glass pylons that rose from the water where the main transit spine had stood. On clear nights, the memorial reflected the stars above and the abyss below, until it looked like the city was still falling. Human cadets studied there before receiving command. Diplomats went there before taking office. Nobody was allowed to speak of proportionality in war without standing over the place where proportionality had drowned. Years later, survivors from liberated systems would say the same thing in different languages. They had not been saved by human anger. They had been saved by human memory. Memory of blackouts, sieges, atrocities, camps, cities on fire, treaties broken at convenient hours, and the simple, ancient lesson that monsters count on decent people needing one more reason to act. Humanity had arrived in the stars carrying all of that history like concealed iron. The galaxy saw clean uniforms, measured voices, open trade, and legal codes polished smooth by patience. It mistook discipline for fragility. It mistook compassion for harmlessness. Hespera taught them the difference. The species they had called naive had built a civilization so controlled that when provoked beyond endurance, it did not lose itself. It removed the sky. That became the truth the galaxy passed down whenever some admiral, minister, or emperor grew too certain that humans could be bullied, cornered, or bloodied into submission. Tell them about Hespera. Tell them the city burned while the council debated procedure. Tell them the empire laughed at a legal notice and woke to a dead sun. Tell them the Terran fleets arrived without fanfare, carried relief beside ammunition, and punished worlds by proving they had always been within reach. Tell them humanity's most frightening weapon was never rage. Not really. It was the decision that rage would be organized. It would be archived. It would be supplied, synchronized, justified, and sustained until every guilty hand opened and every stolen life was counted. Empires had always believed terror belonged to whoever struck first. After Hespera, the stars learned better. They destroyed one human city, and humanity taught the galaxy what darkness was for.